Mystery behind haunted house of Halloween, a Miss Marple Mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple Mystery. I'm Jane, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do? Or what did you do for a living? Maybe you're a chef, a gardener, an artist, or something wonderfully unique. Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy discovering more about our amazing community. Now let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. Gossip over garden walls. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the cool autumn morning, carrying with it the hum of quiet gossip that seemed to rise with the steam from Mrs. Porter's ovens. The village bakery of St. Mildred's was a cheerful little place, golden light in the windows, baskets of crusty loaves on display, and a small bell above the door that tinkled with every arrival. It was the kind of place where news travelled faster than the post, and this morning's topic was as warm as the rolls cooling on the counter. Mrs. Weatherby, wrapped in a shawl the colour of rosehip jam, leaned close to her neighbour. "I heard it myself, I did," she whispered. Music coming from that dreadful house on Hollow Lane, a waltz, faint but clear. Imagine on Halloween night of all time. The vicar, who happened to be choosing a currant bun, raised an eyebrow. "My dear lady," he said with polite disbelief, "it was the wind." Or perhaps the boys with their lanterns again. You'll have the whole village in a panic before the week is out. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a modest cup of tea, appeared absorbed in her knitting, yet she listened with the same attention she once gave to sermons and scandal alike. Her pale blue eyes, gentle but shrewd, followed the rhythm of conversation as one might follow the thread of a tapestry, looking for knots, loose ends and patterns that didn't quite match. "It wasn't the wind," Mrs. Weatherby insisted. "It was a piano." "My late husband had a fine ear, and so do I." "Ah, but Hollow House has been empty for years," murmured Mrs. Porter, sliding a warm loaf onto the counter. "No one's lived there since the Dane woman passed on, unless—" She trailed off, enjoying the suspense. "Unless what?" piped a young boy, clutching a paper bag of ginger snaps. "Unless someone's moved in without saying a word," Mrs. Porter finished softly. A ripple of unease passed through the group. The notion of secrets hiding behind closed curtains appealed to them all in some private way. Miss Marple smiled faintly, stirring her tea. Villages, she thought, were much like bread dough. They rose beautifully, provided no one stirred them too roughly. Across the room, the vicar sighed. "Superstition thrives when people forget to think," he said, dusting crumbs from his sleeve. "If any light was seen, it's more likely a prank or a poacher." "Poachers don't play waltzes," replied Mrs. Weatherby tartly. The laughter that followed loosened the tension, but Miss Marple noticed what others did not. Mrs. Weatherby's voice trembled slightly, as though she spoke from more than imagination. And when the baker refilled her cup, she mentioned quite casually that her delivery boy refused to go near Hollow Lane after sunset. "Says he saw footprints in the frost. Bare feet, he swears. Bare feet in October," Miss Marple mused. That would be unusual indeed. The morning crowd thinned, and as Miss Marple gathered her knitting, the church clock chimed 9. Outside, the air smelled of wet leaves and distant smoke. She thanked Mrs. Porter for the tea and stepped into the lane, her thoughts weaving through the chatter she'd heard, each word a crumb leading towards something faintly out of place. Somewhere amid the warmth of bread and laughter, a truth was waiting to be uncovered. And Miss Marple, who knew that even gossip could hide a clue, intended to find it. That afternoon, the village hall hummed with cheerful chatter as the townsfolk gathered for the mayor's meeting. The long wooden table was crowded with teacups and half-eaten slices of seed cake, and sunlight slanted through the windows, catching the dust like tiny golden motes. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her knitting needles glinting faintly as she worked and listened. The topic of discussion, though meant to be practical, had a curious chill beneath its surface. Mayor Hargreaves cleared his throat importantly. "Now then," he began, smiling around the room, "our annual Halloween fundraiser needs a touch of excitement this year." I thought perhaps we might hold it at Hollow House. A bit of harmless fun, eh? Lanterns, music, costumes. It would do wonders for the old place. The room fell still, as though someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. Mrs. Weatherby's teacup clinked against its saucer. The vicar's wife frowned and murmured something about ill omens. Even the usually boisterous butcher, Mr. Briggs, shifted uneasily in his chair. "It's been empty for years." "Sir," Mrs. Porter said at last. "Best to leave it be. The place has a feeling about it, cold even in summer." The mayor chuckled, though his smile faltered. "Nonsense. A bit of polish and bunting, that's all it needs." But heads were already shaking. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken agreement. Only one voice broke through, a soft, curious one. "I'd like to see it," said a young woman near the window. Clara Dane recently arrived from London, with bright eyes and a polite boldness that marked her as an outsider. "It's just an old house, isn't it? Surely it deserves a little life again." All eyes turned toward her, some surprised, others wary. Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. "Best not to meddle, my dear. Some places remember what's happened in them." Miss Marple watched the exchange with quiet interest. Beneath the polite refusals there was something else, fear, old and well-fed. The villagers' smiles were too quick, their laughter a shade too light. She had seen it before, the way people built stories to cover what they didn't wish to face. As the meeting ended, Clara lingered near the door, her curiosity undimmed. Miss Marple offered a kind smile, but her eyes held a thoughtful glimmer. Whatever lingered inside Hollow House, it was clear the village would rather let it stay there. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Light. Evening settled softly over St. Mildred's, brushing the rooftops in silver and painting the narrow lanes with quiet. Miss Marple, shawl folded neatly around her shoulders, took her customary walk before supper. The air was crisp, tinged with wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of apples drying on kitchen windowsills. Leaves scudded along the cobblestones, whispering like old secrets as she turned toward the outskirts of the village. Hollow Lane lay half in shadow, half in moonlight. The hedgerows stood high and untended, and the trees bowed together overhead, forming a kind of archway that felt almost ceremonial. Beyond them, Hollow House loomed, its windows black, its chimneys crooked against the pale sky. She had passed it countless times before, but tonight there was a curious stillness about it, as though the air itself held its breath. She paused at the gate, the iron rusted and overgrown with ivy. From somewhere inside came a faint sound, delicate, wavering, almost like the echo of a tune remembered rather than played. It took her a moment to recognize it, a waltz, distant and uneven, as if an old gramophone struggled through the years. The melody floated down from the attic window, soft and improbable. Miss Marple frowned slightly. The villagers swore the house was empty, yet a thin golden glow flickered behind the cracked glass, trembling as though the light came from a single candle. She listened again, uncertain whether the tune was real or imagined. The hair at the nape of her neck prickled, not from fear, but from the awareness of something unexplained, a detail that demanded patience and observation. A moment later, the music faltered. The light shivered once, then vanished, swallowed by darkness. The sudden silence felt vast. Even the hedgerows seemed to hush. Miss Marple remained at the gate a while longer, watching the empty windows. Finally, she turned back toward the village, her steps unhurried but thoughtful. To others, it might have been nothing. Wind, reflection, a trick of tired eyes, but she knew how often truth hid behind the ordinary. And if Hollow House truly stood deserted, then someone, or something, had been there to snuff out that flame. The next morning brought drizzle and the comforting patter of rain on window panes. Miss Marple had just set her teapot on the tray when a knock sounded at her door, brisk, official, and a touch uncertain. Constable Green stood on the step, his cap askew, cheeks flushed from the damp. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he began, "but I thought you ought to know. There've been reports again. Shadows moving near Hollow House last night. Indeed, she said mildly, ushering him in. You must be soaked. Sit down and have a cup of tea while you tell me everything. He hesitated only a moment before accepting. The warmth of her sitting room seemed to loosen his tongue. Mrs. Weatherby claims she saw figures, 2 of them, cross the garden just after 9. Could have been youngsters playing tricks, though I didn't find footprints. Miss Marple poured the tea and smiled faintly. Yet you went out there yourself, didn't you? The constable blinked. Well, yes. Just to be thorough, you understand. No harm in checking. And what did you see? She asked, her tone kind but curious. He stared into his cup. A light up in the attic, faint but steady. I thought perhaps someone's taken shelter there. But when I opened the gate, it was gone, like it knew I'd come. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Curious that you'd know it was the attic, she said gently. Mrs. Weatherby only mentioned the garden. Constable Green looked up sharply, realizing his slip. Colour rose in his face. Must have been lucky guesswork, he muttered. She smiled, offering another biscuit. Of course. Luck and a good memory solve many mysteries, don't they? Outside, the rain deepened, and Hollow House waited silently on the hill, holding its secrets a little longer. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Window. The morning mist clung to the village like lace, softening the edges of every rooftop and hedge. Miss Marple was on her way to the grocer's when she noticed young Tommy Fletcher sitting on the low wall by the green, his knees scuffed and his face unusually solemn. His mother was inside the shop, but the boy's wide eyes were fixed on something only he could see. She paused beside him. Good morning, Tommy. You look rather thoughtful for such a fine day. Have you lost something? He shook his head. Didn't lose it, Ma'am. I saw it. Saw what, dear? He leaned closer, lowering his voice. The lady in the window. Up at Hollow House. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild surprise, though inside she felt that small stirring of interest she always did when truth wrapped itself in wonder. A lady, you say? And what was she doing? Just looking, he said, earnest as only a child could be. She had white on, like a nightdress maybe, and her hair was all shiny in the light. I waved, but she didn't wave back. Then she was gone. Miss Marple smiled gently. When was this? Last night, before supper. Mum told me to hurry home, but I saw her plain as anything. She nodded, as if considering a school riddle. Sometimes the evening light plays tricks, Tommy. Shadows turn to faces, reflections move when the wind shakes a curtain. But it's good you told someone, he frowned. You think I made it up? Oh, not at all, she said kindly. It's just that sometimes our eyes tell the truth differently from our hearts. The boy pondered that, his brow furrowed. She looked sad, he whispered after a pause, like she was waiting. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently from her arm as she looked toward the hill where Hollow House stood, dim in the mist. A woman in white, waiting. The image fit too neatly into the village's superstitions, yet children often noticed what adults refused to see. Thank you, Tommy, she said softly. You've been most helpful. As she continued down the lane, her thoughts turned inward. Grief, she reflected, often left its own kind of haunting. A face glimpsed at dusk, a light rekindled in an empty room. Perhaps not ghosts at all, but memories that refused to rest. Still she resolved to pass Hollow House again that evening. After all, it was better to look once with clear eyes than to let fear cloud the view forever. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again at the village tea-room, where Clara Dane sat by the window with a notebook and a pot of strong Assam. The young woman looked up as Miss Marple approached, her face brightening with relief. I hoped I'd see you, she said. You might find this curious. From her handbag, Clara drew out an old photograph, sepia-tinted, the corners frayed with age. She laid it gently on the table between them. I found it among my aunt's things. It's Hollow House, sometime before the war. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The image showed the house in better days. Ivy trimmed neatly, windows polished, the front garden full of roses. A small group stood on the steps, a gentleman with a proud stance, 2 servants beside him, and a woman in a pale gown at the top of the stairs. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, her expression calm, distant, almost melancholy. "She's the one," Clara murmured. "The lady the child described, isn't she?" Miss Marple studied the picture without answering at once. The woman's posture was graceful but strained, as though she were pretending to belong to a moment she already wished to leave. Her dress shimmered faintly where the light had caught it, white, or nearly so. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "If Tommy's memory is true, she would look much like this." Clara hesitated. "My mother once told me she was a relative, an aunt who never married. There was talk of heartbreak, perhaps even scandal." "I think she died in that house." The rain tapped gently against the glass. Miss Marple traced the edge of the photograph with a gloved finger. "Old sorrow lingers, my dear. Sometimes it settles like dust in corners no one thinks to clean." Clara sighed. "Do you believe such things stay behind?" "I believe people do," Miss Marple replied. "In memory, in rumour, even in the way a window catches the light." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 generations divided by years, yet united by quiet understanding. Outside, the mist deepened, blurring the view of the hill where Hollow House waited, its windows dark, perhaps watching them in return. Chapter 4. Clues in Candlelight. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the village rinsed clean and glistening. Miss Marple arrived at Clara Dane's cottage just as the clock struck 11. It was a cheerful little house, whitewashed and warm, with lavender in the window boxes and the faint aroma of baking bread wafting from the kitchen. Clara greeted her with a smile and ushered her inside. "I'm so glad you could come," Clara said, pouring tea into fine china cups. "I've been going through more of my aunt's things, and I keep finding puzzles instead of memories." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a nod. "The past often prefers to speak in riddles, my dear. Tell me what troubles you." Clara fetched a small wooden box from the sideboard. These were her letters, at least what's left of them. "My aunt, Margaret Dane, owned Hollow House before it was sold to strangers. Everyone in the family believed she left everything in order, but when I checked the old papers, some were missing. There are gaps, months at a time. Do the missing ones matter?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara hesitated. "They might. There's a letter from a solicitor dated the year before she died, mentioning a change to her will. But the second letter, the one that should confirm it, isn't here. Nor are her personal notes from that period." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "And who handled her estate?" "My cousin Leonard," Clara replied. "He was executor." "He said she was ill, confused toward the end. But the more I read, the more I wonder if someone wanted certain things forgotten." Miss Marple looked up, her expression kind but searching. "Letters do go missing, of course, but sometimes they're removed with purpose," Clara sighed, pressing a hand to the box. "I feel as though the house itself holds what's missing. Every time I walk past it, I sense something unresolved, like an unfinished conversation." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Houses do have long memories, and so often do families." The clock ticked softly between them, each sound measured and deliberate, like the unspoken questions that lingered in the air. Miss Marple reached for her teacup again, her mind already fitting these new pieces into the quiet puzzle that Hollow House had become. The following afternoon was bright but cool, with a silvery wind brushing through the hedgerows. Miss Marple took her customary walk past Hollow House, her knitting tucked neatly into her handbag in case she felt inclined to sit somewhere quiet. The old gate stood slightly ajar, creaking faintly as she passed. It was curiosity, not mischief, that made her glance closer. The letterbox on the gatepost hung open, its flap bent from years of neglect. Something pale and brittle fluttered just inside. She reached in delicately, pulling free a torn piece of paper, its edges damp and curling. The ink had faded to brown, but a few words remained legible. Her eyes narrowed as she read, "Cannot pay more. If you continue to write, destroyed me once already. No forgiveness left." The rest was lost to time and rain. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the empty garden. The words were unmistakable in tone. Someone at some time had been desperate, driven by fear or guilt, perhaps both. She folded the fragment carefully, as though it might crumble in protest, and slipped it into her pocket. There was a curious neatness to the discovery. A gatepost was hardly the place to hide anything of value, yet the letter seemed almost planted, tucked just deeply enough to survive unnoticed. If it had been part of a larger message, who had placed it there, and for whom had it waited season after season? Further down the lane, the church bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple began to walk again, her steps unhurried. The village, at first glance, appeared as placid as ever, curtains drawn just so, windows polished, gardens trimmed. But beneath the calm lay a pulse of quiet unease. She had lived long enough to know that gossip might hide a scandal, and polite smiles could mask small acts of cruelty. At the end of the path, she paused and looked back toward Hollow House. The shutters were closed now, the shadows gathering early around the eaves. In her pocket, the letter fragment rustled softly, an old voice refusing to stay silent. Chapter 5. The Masked Ball. By the last week of October, the village was dressed in its autumn best. Paper lanterns hung from the chestnut trees, ribbons fluttered from the lamp-posts, and every shop window displayed pumpkins carved with cheerful, if slightly crooked, grins. The long-debated Halloween fete, once meant for Hollow House, had been rescued by the vicar's good sense and transferred to the church hall. It was warmer there, safer, and, as Mrs. Weatherby loudly proclaimed, free from nonsense about ghosts. Inside, the air was fragrant with spiced cakes and mulled cider. Children darted between tables of toffee apples, their laughter echoing beneath the rafters. The villagers had arrived in good spirits, many of them in homemade costumes, cats, pirates, and witches galore. Even Miss Marple, though she declined to don a disguise, wore a sprig of orange ribbon at her shoulder, which suited her rather well. For a while, everything felt perfectly ordinary. Then, as the clock struck 8, the door at the far end opened. A hush rippled through the room. Standing in the doorway was a figure dressed entirely in white, an old-fashioned gown that shimmered like frost under the lights, and a porcelain mask with painted tears at the corners of its eyes. Someone whispered, "The ghost of Hollow House," and the words spread like a draught through the crowd. The figure moved slowly, gracefully across the floor. The vicar looked uneasy. Mrs. Weatherby fanned herself furiously. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in her hands as she watched with mild interest. Then came the unmasking. The vicar, with a polite but trembling smile, asked for the wearer's identity. All in good fun, of course. The masked guest hesitated only a moment before lifting the porcelain away. A collective gasp followed. It was Clara Dane. Her face was pale but determined, her eyes gleaming with something fierce beneath the candlelight. "I thought," she said softly, "that perhaps it was time we stopped being afraid of the past." The silence that met her words was not quite comfortable, nor entirely hostile. It was the silence of a room that suddenly realized a game had become something real. Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes steady. Something was about to surface, and she knew the village would never be quite the same again. The tension in the hall lingered like smoke, but laughter began to return in cautious bursts. Clara's daring entrance was soon absorbed into the hum of chatter and music once more. The musicians struck up a waltz, and the scent of apple tarts drifted through the air. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes half-lidded in that deceptively placid way that concealed a keen alertness. She noticed, as she often did, the small things, the tremor in Clara's hand as she set down her cup, the way the mayor's wife kept glancing toward her necklace, a glittering string of garnets that caught the candlelight like drops of blood. It happened quite suddenly. Mrs. Pembroke, the mayor's wife, leaned forward to greet a guest, her pearls swinging dangerously close to the punch bowl. There was a sharp snap, followed by a gasp. Beads scattered like hail across the polished floor, rolling under tables and chairs. Children squealed and stooped to chase them. Gentlemen bent gallantly to assist. Miss Marple rose, moving through the commotion with quiet grace. "Careful, everyone," she murmured. "They're rather fine, aren't they?" Mrs. Pembroke fluttered anxiously. "Oh, my husband bought it years ago, Paris, I think." "What a dreadful accident!" But when Miss Marple knelt to retrieve one bead that had rolled against her shoe, she felt something peculiar. The bead was lighter than it should have been. Her thumb pressed gently, and the surface gave way with a faint click. A tiny half-inch key dropped into her palm, glinting like a secret. For a moment, she simply looked at it, then at the bead's hollow shell. Around her, the laughter had resumed, the catastrophe dismissed as nothing more than a social mishap. Clara was helping sweep up the beads, though her expression had tightened with interest when she saw Miss Marple's hand close around something. "Are you all right, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone too casual. "Oh, perfectly, my dear," the older woman replied, "though one must wonder why a necklace would be hiding such a thing." She slipped the key discreetly into her pocket, her eyes thoughtful. Later, as the guests drifted home under the cool October moon, Miss Marple lingered by the church gate. The key felt warm in her hand now, as though it had absorbed the energy of the evening, the whispers, the laughter, the undercurrent of unease. Somewhere it belonged to a lock that had not been opened in years. She watched Clara speaking softly with the vicar, her white costume luminous against the dark. And in that stillness Miss Marple thought again of Hollow House, the shuttered windows, the attic where a light had flickered and died. Yes, a tiny key could open very large questions, and before the next dawn she intended to discover exactly which door it fit. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Cellar. The moon hung low over St. Mildred's, a pale lantern casting silver across the empty lanes. Miss Marple, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, walked beside Clara Dane in silence. The younger woman carried a small torch and an air of nervous resolve. They had told no one of their errand, not the vicar, not even Mrs. Weatherby, whose fondness for gossip would have set the entire village whispering by sunrise. The iron gates of Hollow House groaned as Clara pushed them open. The gravel path was thick with weeds, and the windows above them were blank and dark. A chill breeze rustled through the ivy that clung to the stone walls, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something older, fainter, perhaps dust, perhaps memory. Inside, the air was still thick with disuse. Clara's torchbeam danced across cracked wallpaper and veiled furniture. "It feels wrong to be here," she murmured. Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Quite. But I've often found that the truth dislikes waiting until morning." Her voice was calm, but her eyes moved constantly, catching details others might overlook. The half-burned candle on the mantelpiece, a fresh footprint in the dust, the faint draught that stirred the curtains. They made their way toward the back of the house, where the narrow staircase led down to the cellar. Each step creaked underfoot, echoing faintly through the hollow rooms. Clara shivered, clutching her torch tighter. "Do you suppose anyone else has been here?" "Someone has," Miss Marple replied softly. "And quite recently, I think." At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar door stood slightly ajar. Clara hesitated, her face pale in the dim light. "It might be dangerous." "Only if we turn back now," Miss Marple said. They stepped through together. The cellar smelled of earth and old wine, the air damp and heavy. Shelves lined the walls, their contents hidden beneath yellowing cloths. Somewhere above, a shutter banged faintly in the wind. Then, without warning, the door behind them swung shut with a low, deliberate thud. Clara spun, her breath catching. "That was no breeze," Miss Marple answered. Her torch was steady, her expression unreadable. In the soft dark, her calm voice carried like a thread. "Well, my dear, it seems someone objects to our curiosity." And as the echo of the closing door faded, the silence of Hollow House settled around them, dense, patient, and listening. For a long moment, neither woman moved. The cellar seemed to breathe around them, its walls thick with shadow, its silence disturbed only by the faint tick of dripping water. Then Miss Marple, ever composed, lifted her torch and swept the beam across the shelves. Dust motes danced like tiny ghosts in the light. Beneath one tattered cloth, she glimpsed the edge of a wooden chest, its brass fittings green with age. "Would you be kind enough to help me with this corner, my dear?" she asked, her tone as mild as if she were rearranging flowers. Together, they lifted away the covering. Inside lay a jumble of objects, broken candlesticks, an empty wine bottle and a leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked but intact. Miss Marple brushed off the dust and opened it with careful hands. The pages smelled faintly of ink and cellar air. Each line was written in the same looping hand, names, dates, and tidy sums of money. Clara leaned closer, frowning. "These look like payments." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "but not household accounts. These were transactions, perhaps, or hush money." Her finger paused at a name written near the end. Margaret Dane. Clara's eyes widened. "My aunt," she whispered. The next entry was dated the week of her aunt's death. The handwriting trembled there, as though interrupted. No total was written, no signature, just a long ink blot that had spread like spilled secrecy. "Why stop there?" Clara asked. "Why leave it unfinished?" Miss Marple studied the smudge, her expression grave. Because whoever wrote this didn't have the chance to finish. Or perhaps they didn't want to record what came next. They turned a few more pages, finding nothing but blankness. The ledger ended abruptly, like a conversation cut short. Somewhere above them, a board creaked, the sound of weight shifting, of someone moving unseen. Clara's grip tightened on the book. "Take it," Miss Marple said quietly, "but keep it hidden until we know whom it threatens." As they made their way back toward the cellar door, the old key in Miss Marple's pocket pressed sharply against her palm. One mystery had led them here, but the ledger promised another. The handwriting might have faded, but the secrets it held had not yet finished speaking. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. By the next morning, the fog that had hung over St. Mildred's began to lift, both in the sky and in Miss Marple's mind. She sat by the fire in her neat little parlour, the ledger open beside her teacup. Each name now had a face, each date a faint echo of whispered scandal. The pattern was plain enough once one looked closely. Quiet payments made to villagers who had reason to stay silent. Mrs. Pembroke's pearls, for instance, had not come from Paris after all, but from gratitude. Her husband had profited handsomely from land once belonging to Margaret Dane's estate. The mayor's signature appeared twice, discreetly disguised. Even the vicar's name was there, though next to only a modest amount, suggesting he had been persuaded to lend moral weight to a convenient fiction, and that fiction was the haunting. The ghost of Hollow House had served its purpose well, keeping curious buyers away while certain parties siphoned funds from the estate's unclaimed trust. A stolen inheritance hidden beneath superstition, protected by whispers and candle-lit fear. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. "People," she murmured, "will always prefer a haunting to a scandal. It feels so much more respectable." Across the road she saw Clara approaching, the morning sun glinting in her hair. Miss Marple closed the ledger and poured an extra cup of tea. The time had come to speak plainly, of greed, of guilt, and of the way truth, like morning light, eventually finds its way through even the smallest crack in the curtains. That evening, Hollow House was no longer silent. The fire Miss Marple had coaxed into the old hearth burned brightly now, chasing shadows from the corners. Clara sat at the long oak table, her face pale but resolute, while her cousin Henry stood before them, the ledger open like a mirror of guilt. "I didn't mean for it to go so far," he began, his voice breaking on the words. "After Aunt Margaret died, I thought no one would notice if I'd borrowed a little. The money was just sitting there, unclaimed. Then the solicitors began asking questions and I panicked." "So you invented the ghost," Miss Marple said softly. "A clever deterrent. No one wishes to buy or inspect a haunted house." He nodded, shame bowing his shoulders. "I thought if I frightened the village enough, the matter would fade. I used her old music box, lights in the window, even—" He swallowed. "Even that scream on the first night?" Clara looked up sharply. "But that wasn't you, was it?" Henry hesitated, colour draining from his face. "No," he whispered. "That wasn't me.
For a moment the flames crackled louder, filling the silence that followed.
Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained watchful. "Guilt," she said gently, "has a way of creating its own ghosts, Mr. Dane. Perhaps your aunt wanted the truth seen at last." He buried his face in his hands, the confession weighing heavier than any haunting. Outside, the October wind sighed through the ivy, carrying the faint echo of music long stopped. Clara reached for Miss Marple's hand, grateful for her calm presence amid the wreckage of old secrets. But somewhere in the rafters a loose board creaked, as if someone unseen still listened. Chapter 8. Calm After the Storm. The next day dawned bright and golden, washing away the night's chill, as if the entire village had drawn a deep, contented breath. Hollow House, so long a symbol of whispers and unease, seemed almost reborn in the morning light. Its tall windows caught the sun for the first time in years, scattering soft reflections across the dew-soaked grass. The ivy that once looked sinister now fluttered gently in the breeze, a living curtain for a house rediscovering its warmth. Miss Marple stood at the gate, her shawl tucked neatly about her shoulders, watching as the villagers filed up the path. There were brooms and buckets, ladders and laughter. Mrs. Weatherby had brought scones, declaring, "Even ghosts can't
Resist a bit of jam?" And the vicar supervised the sweeping of the old stone steps.
Clara moved among them, her sleeves rolled, her hair catching the light, her smile no longer shadowed by fear. Inside, dust motes danced in sunbeams, and the faint scent of beeswax polish began to replace that of damp neglect. Someone opened all the windows, letting in a rush of cool, clean air. The sound of cheerful voices echoed through the corridors that had once whispered only to themselves. A child found the old gramophone in the corner, and with a squeal of delight wound it until a tune creaked softly to life, a wavering melody that made everyone pause for a moment before smiling. Miss Marple wandered quietly through the rooms, her footsteps slow and thoughtful. She paused by the fireplace where a cobweb still hung in one corner, untouched. "Even houses," she murmured. "Remember kindness when they feel it again." She brushed the cobweb away, her touch as gentle as her tone. By midday the great hall was filled with sunlight and laughter. Windows gleamed, the hearth crackled, and the house that had been shunned now felt alive with belonging. Clara brought Miss Marple a cup of tea, her eyes bright. "I'd like to open the place again," she said softly. "Not as it was, but as something new, something welcoming." Miss Marple smiled, the lines at her eyes deepening with quiet approval. "A fine idea, my dear. After all, forgiveness and furniture both do better when aired." The laughter that followed was light and easy. Outside, the church bell chimed 11, its sound drifting across the autumn air. And for the first time in many seasons, Hollow House stood not as a mystery, but as part of the village once more, content in the calm after its long storm. ChatGPT said, by the next morning, Hollow House stood quiet again beneath a soft grey sky. The ivy trembled in the breeze, and a pale light touched the windows that had once seemed so forbidding. Down in the village, the talk was already spreading. How Miss Marple had seen through it all, how there had been no ghost after all, only greed wrapped in shadow and superstition. Yet, as Miss Marple sat at her favourite corner table in the Rose and Crown Inn, she thought it was not quite as simple as that. Her tea arrived steaming, a slice of buttered toast beside it. Outside the window she could see Mrs. Weatherby animatedly, describing last night's events to a group of neighbours, her gestures as lively as ever. A part of Miss Marple smiled at that. After all, gossip was the village's most enduring pastime. But beneath it lay something else, a need to make sense of the unknown, to shape fear into story. People, she murmured, stirring her tea, rarely invent ghosts without reason. Sometimes it's guilt that rattles the chains. She thought of Henry Dane's bowed head, of Clara's quiet forgiveness, and of the way truth had drifted into the open like morning mist clearing from a field. Fear, she reflected, was such a convenient disguise. It allowed one to hide selfishness, to avoid confession, to give misdeeds the shape of something otherworldly. Yet, in the end, truth had a way of creeping through even the smallest cracks, like dawn slipping past curtains, patient and certain. A young waitress passed and paused by her table. "Is it true, Miss Marple, about the haunting?" Miss Marple looked up, her eyes kind. "My dear, there are all sorts of hauntings in life. Not all of them need a ghost." The girl blinked, smiled shyly, and moved on. Miss Marple finished her tea, folded her napkin, and gazed once more at the village beyond the glass. Peaceful now, ordinary again. She thought of Hollow House, of secrets laid to rest, and of the quiet courage it sometimes takes to face the truth without candlelight or costume. And softly, she wondered, as she suspected her listeners might too, what she herself would have believed, the ghost or the gossip.